Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you guys are all awake. I'm trying a little experiment for me, which is for the first time, I have no slides. So that means you got to listen or fall asleep. If I get really boring, I'll take that as a sign that I should speed it up. So as Bill said earlier today, I am not a professional organizational design, organizational development guy. In fact, a lot of the theory that has been talked about today is actually very new to me. I like to think of myself as more of a experimenter. I'm just a guy who likes to try things. And today what I want to talk about is essentially a series of experiments that we did in the agency that I ran for the government of Washington, D.C., the Office of the Chief Technology Officer, or OCTO. Now, before I get into that, I just want to state that the problem, one of the big problems as I see it, is that we tend to, in all organizations, focus on structure as opposed over everything else. You know, we look at hierarchies, we look at actual organizations, reporting lines, and we've talked a little bit about that today. The solution to this, obviously, then, as we've discussed, is that we need to start focusing on people as the most important part of any organization, as opposed to the structure. Now, I think a lot of organizations out there pay lip service to this. You hear a lot of CEOs, a lot of managers say our people are the most important thing, we're going to do right by them. But the question that I always have is how many organizations actually treat their employees in this way? And I think the answer is not that many. So today, I want to illustrate what I think is potentially a mechanism for achieving this through the work that we did at OCTO. And I think it's interesting because governments are perhaps one of the most highly structured, least flexible organizations out there. So if we can do it, at least to an extent in government, I think it should be possible in many different places. Now, I did have a little bit of an advantage. The government that I walked into was led by a relatively young mayor. He was 36 when he was elected. And the nature of this organization was incredibly fast-paced. It was quick decisions. They wanted to get stuff done. There was some politics and some thought paid to that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, they really focused on letting people do their jobs, the heads of these agencies. And so I was fortunate to walk into that situation. So starting the story, this really kind of falls into three main parts. And the first one I'll call tearing down the walls. So when I walked into the agency, for the past couple of years, before I'd gotten there, the agency had held quarterly, what they called all-hands meetings. And this is pretty much what you would expect. The leadership of the agency would stand up and give some kind of a presentation about how the agency had performed the quarter before that, maybe call some employees out for good performance, really go through a series of reports, if you will. And it just so happened that 6 days after I started, we had one of these all-hands meetings. And it actually turned out that this was the most important of the all-hands meetings because it was the end of the fiscal year and beginning of the new fiscal year. And that was the one where they all talked about yearly performance, if we hit our metrics, what the status was for next year, budgets, all of that kind of stuff. Now, I could have postponed this meeting. I had a legitimate excuse. I mean, I'd started 6 days before that, so what do I know, right? But I figured that it was important to kind of keep continuity, especially since, to be honest, nobody in the agency had known I was coming. It was sort of a surprise to everybody, including myself, about the actual start date. So, and that's a long story in and of itself. But I had a problem because, what do you say to people, first of all, who know nothing about you, especially when you know nothing about the organization, you know nothing about the structure, you know nothing about the people, you know nothing or very little about the mission, and you've never worked a day in your life in the public sector. So how do you kind of reconcile all that into a rousing, kind of, this is what we're going to do under my tenure kind of statement? So, I took a stab at this, and I said, all right, it's government, it's structured, it's got hierarchy, it's conservative. Let me take a guess and say that one of the problems that we have to face is tearing down some of these organizational silos and get people to work better together. Now, I got a little lucky because this meeting, we rotated where the meetings were held, and this one happened to be held at a public school in the district called School Without Walls. So I was able to leverage a super cheesy pun and call the presentation OCTO Without Walls. Sort of setting the vision for what we were trying to do. And, the general theory was that, the organization was a good organization, it had good people, we could be greater than we were if we focused on, trying to remove some of these organizational silos and get people to work better together. Now, I laid out this sort of pitch and this vision in three main pieces. The first of which centered around the idea of setting a common mission, regardless of the function of anyone's individual job. And in this particular case, in the first few days as I thought about what the agency was there to do, I realized that we were really a shared services organization, right? Our job was to provide a set of services to other agencies in the government as the central IT shop, and also to provide external services to citizens out in the city of DC. So my theory then was that as a shared services organization, the one thing that we should really be focused on more than anything else was customer satisfaction. And not just focusing on customer satisfaction from a theoretical perspective, but figuring out how to measure that, right? So that we could actually look at the way people were achieving this concept of customer sat and then holding them accountable to it and tracking our progress. And I figured if we did this for every employee in the agency, then we should be able to align each individual's incentives with their particular jobs in such a way that we could encourage this cross-silo communication and collaboration. Now, okay, this isn't rocket science, right? This is nothing new. It's not like I'm a genius that stood up and came up with this. I might argue that governments typically don't focus on customer satisfaction, so maybe that was a little bit of a new thing. But previous CTOs had absolutely laid out mission statements and vision statements, and everybody had kind of heard this stuff before. And my last statement, I'll never forget this. My last statement at that presentation was a very trite, admittedly very trite statement, which is, my door is always open, right? You can always come in and always talk to me. And that point, the point that this was sort of nothing new, was kind of rammed home to me when this guy in the audience of a couple hundred people stands up, and the first question that anybody asked me after that was, they said, this all sounds really great, but we've heard this before. How do we know that you're telling the truth? And that was the first time I met Bill Sivak. So, and that is a true story. I don't think he remembered that until just now. The only thing I could think of to say at the time was, honestly, you're just going to have to trust me. Because what else do you say to that? How do you convince somebody, how do you convince 200 people that have no idea who you are, that this thing that you just said is true? Now, I thought about that a lot over the 18 months that I was doing that job. And I think, Bill, the fact that you asked that question really made me focus on making sure that that statement was true. And I can honestly say that any moment that I was in the office, my door was never shut. Anybody in the agency could and did eventually learn that they could walk in. But the important lesson there, I think, is that the fact that I was able to hold true to that particular promise showed the folks in the agency that, that this demonstration was able to help them adopt this mission of cross-agency collaboration by focusing on customer satisfaction. That because I sort of walked the talk, as it were, they felt a responsibility to do the same thing. So if I had to summarize sort of this piece, I would say that the main concept here is to start the process, in any agency or any organization, is to start the process of breaking down these silos by providing a common mission for every employee, regardless of what their specific job function is or what they're responsible for doing. But this has to have two main characteristics. It's got to unite everybody beyond the demands of their specific job. So in terms of customer satisfaction, nobody's job was to do customer satisfaction. But at the end of the day, everybody's job was to do customer satisfaction. But then secondly, and as I mentioned, most importantly, you have to be able to measure it. You have to come up with a way of actually quantitatively and objectively measuring this thing that you're setting as a goal. So we were able to do both of those things, and I think that was sort of the foundation that we set to kind of move to this next step. This next step is all about failure. Now, many in the government, we actually, this was a relatively technocratic government, and we used a lot of different forms of measurement to track agency performance. One of the ones that I want to focus on right now is this thing that was called CAPSTAT. And it was this general mechanism called a stat mechanism. And the idea is that the mayor's executive staff used this as a way to really track agency performance over time. They would gather metrics, call everybody together in a big room, and kind of track how they performed with respect to these metrics and hold people accountable to making the lines go in the right direction and following through on promises and things like that. Now in Octo, we sort of had a subset of this mechanism called TechStat. And very similar. We would do a deep dive based on sort of objective data on an area that we thought needed attention. So if a program wasn't living up to expectations, we would call it in for a TechStat. We would go through this process. And I think this was a pretty effective technique, especially in a conservative organization like a government, because it focused on data, it focused on metrics, it focused on moving lines in the right direction. But there are two ways that you can play this as somebody who's leading a TechStat role or a TechStat session. One is you can be the sort of gotcha guy, right? You can stand up and you can say, you pour through a bunch of data and say, you're doing this wrong, change it, do it right, we're gonna check up on you, and if you don't do it right, we're gonna fire you. Or you could act almost as a therapist, right? You can provide an interested ear. You can, leverage the position to offer a guiding hand in some cases. You can ask questions. Most importantly, you can do a lot of listening. And that's sort of the way that I approached it. I thought it was much better to kind of let people talk these things out, work through solutions, ask how we can help as opposed to how can you do better. And so it became an interesting mechanism from that perspective. Now, one session in particular during my tenure stood out, and it still sticks out in my mind. We had a team of 17 people that was implementing citizen-facing technology for another agency. So that agency had essentially outsourced their operations to us. This team had been working together for quite some time, and by all external accounts, both the agency and citizens, in fact, somebody in this room today told me what a good job they were doing. They were doing a good job. They were executing on everything they had promised. The technology was good. It worked the way it was. They hit deadlines, all that kind of stuff. But it had come to my attention through actually several members of that group taking advantage of this open door policy that I had, that there were some serious internal issues that really threatened the continued success of this group. So, I decided, okay, let's have a TechStat session. Let's focus on this group and its performance and see if we can kind of divine what the issues are and kind of get work through those. Now, the session was fascinating. I don't know any other word for it. It started off as many TechStat sessions did. We looked at a whole bunch of data, and we started focusing in on certain areas that the data indicated were an issue. But it quickly became obvious, based on the conversation that was happening, that there was no amount of process reengineering or rework that we could do that would fix these problems. It literally turned into a therapy session. I mean, I'm not kidding, people started crying in this meeting. It was interesting because it really highlighted the fact that the issues that this group had were personal issues. They were, you had everything from cliques of people from different regions in India who wouldn't talk to each other. You had personality conflicts. You ended up having, the reason that this team was successful is because you had one or two people who literally did all the work because they were the ones that were trusted. They were the ones that, could get stuff done. And so it was fascinating how this problem came up and how we looked at it through the TechStat. It's a longer story how we actually resolved that. I'll kind of touch on a couple things later, but what I want to focus on here is the catalyst for that series of events. And the catalyst was those individuals who actually came forward and said, hey, we have a problem. Even though the metrics don't necessarily show it, we have a problem. And for me, this was an incredibly positive experience because at the highest level, we uncovered these people problems and we solved them the right way by focusing on the people. But the only reason that we were able to do this was because somebody, or a few people actually, had the courage to go against the natural incentives of not just the group, but the organization as a whole, and come up and say, hey, we've got a problem here, we have to fix this. So in other words, they took a chance, which could have resulted in massive disaster for them, right? I mean, they didn't know me really well, right? I could have either laughed them out of the office, I could have gone to talk to the manager and said, hey, this person came to me and said this, she could have then fired them. I mean, all kinds of crazy things could have happened. But they took this chance, and to me, that was the really interesting and important thing. When you think about failure, most organizations out there, and governments in particular, I think literally make it nearly impossible to fail because there aren't any incentives out there at all other than for people to succeed, meaning that, especially as a government employee, you've got no reason to do anything that doesn't result in success because there's no penalty for success. Success results in sort of everything staying the same, status quo, whereas failure results in all kinds of bad stuff happening to you. Letters in your file, demotions, maybe even being fired, what have you. And so because you can't do anything which might constitute failure, that means you don't do anything at all, or you don't do anything at all that's new because you have no option to do that. So what I think we really need to do, and I think this transcends government, this goes across just about any organization, is really encourage failure. But we have to do this intelligently, and the way that I think we have to do this is through something I'll call validated learning. What it means is that we need to basically create these experimental loops, which, where we basically start by saying, what are we trying to learn by a given experiment? Defining the measurements that we're going to measure our success by, and then designing what the actual experiment's going to be to generate the metrics so that we can learn whether something's going to work or something's not going to work. And the idea is that you design this loop, and then you execute that loop as quickly as possible. And when you get to the end of it, if you've designed it right, you've got you basically have an A/B test. Did this thing work? Great. If it did, fold it in. Did it not work? Okay, it's a failure, but that's good because we learned what didn't work, and we're able to fold that into the process going forward. So I think the summary of this step then, we need to allow people and organizations to experiment, and we need to embrace failure. As long as we learn the reasons behind that failure, and then we fold that into the operation and move on to the next experiment. So that's the second one. The third piece I'll call empowerment. Now, the third quarterly all-hands meeting rolled around. This is about 6-7 months after I started. And admittedly, I was a bit frustrated. These meetings were boring, okay? Deathly boring. And I think Bill and Monty can validate that they were no fun. I couldn't really see how they added value other than checking the box called communication, right? We did communication because we did quarterly all-hands meetings. And so, this idea had been percolating in me for a while that just because it was a government job didn't necessarily mean that it needed to be prescriptive and kind of bound in reams of red tape. I mean, why couldn't it be fun? Why couldn't it be a good place to go and a good thing to do? Why couldn't we be as efficient and as effective in the private sector? I mean, after all, we have a good mission, right? We're trying to help people. We're trying to provide services for the citizens of the district. So, we were well on our way, sort of, to the point of focusing on this core mission of customer satisfaction. We had started to not only allow, but encourage experimentation and sort of that learning through failure that I described. So I thought the next logical step here would be to codify our policies to provide freedom for our employees to execute their specific jobs and the way that they worked in their own way. And in government especially, this is extremely important because, as you guys probably know, official policies really drive everything. People don't breathe unless there's a policy that says you're allowed to breathe. So I've been doing a bunch of reading of different things over the past few months, and one thing that really stuck out at me was this thing called a results-only work environment, or a ROE, because it was very conceptually simple to me as a set of guiding principles and a way that we could structure a work environment to allow people to do this thing. How many people here know what a ROE is or have heard of a ROE? A few of you. Okay, for those of you who haven't, it's very, very simple. In a nutshell, what it does is it says that we are going to treat you as a responsible adult. We are going to, instead of telling you where to be, when to be there, what to wear, what to eat, when to take a break, we're going to let you do your job. And we're going to let you do your job in whatever way you want. If you want to go see a movie at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, go ahead. Don't even tell us. But the key is that you have to get your work done. You have to deliver on your objectives, and you have to do it in a way that makes sense. So at this all-hands meeting, this was the statement, right? And I put up a slide that had the cover of Fortune magazine's 100 Best Places to Work with the Octo logo superimposed on it and said, why can't we do this? Why can't we be this? Why can't we make the cover of Fortune magazine next month? So next 4 or 5 months, we kicked off this migration. And this was a huge change, and I can go into a lot of details why this is a bigger change than it might sound like, but it's a huge change for a lot of people, including the overall institution. And one example I think that was particularly illustrative of this change and of the difficulty of this is that we had formed a cross-functional team to manage the migration. It was comprised of a diagonal slice through the agency of relatively well-respected individuals. And when I started this process, I had told the mayor and the city administrator and the HR director that we were going to do this. I wanted them to know. I had also gone to a private sector think tank called the Center for American Progress, and they had put somebody on it who literally followed us around and reported in a weekly blog publicly about our failures and successes. And I did that for two reasons. One, because I wanted to create a blueprint for other organizations, not just governments, to do this. And two, I figured if we could get ahead of the potential negative publicity, then how could you say that we were doing this in secret, right? I mean, we're doing it in public, so you can't complain. So, we start doing this process, and then all of a sudden, one night, I get a phone call late at night from the city administrator, and he goes, "What the hell are you doing?" Okay, and it turns out that somebody on this design team had actually taken copies of those Center for American Progress articles and some internal documentation that we were developing for this process and faxed it to the city administrator anonymously, along with the HR director. So, even though they knew, they didn't know, it was kind of it was an issue. I had to do a lot of damage control. There were a lot of tense moments. But I did actually decide to tell the team because I thought that, it was important enough that people understood that this was happening, and maybe somebody would stand up and say, "Yeah, that was me and I'm sorry." Well, nobody stood up. It was very emotional. Again, more tears, people started crying. But the interesting thing that came out of that, I think, was that even though we didn't figure out who did it, it built this weird sense of trust among the team, and it actually increased our resolve to get this thing done. So I think, again, that the concept of trust is hugely important there, and it's one that kept coming up. Over the course of the planning, we encouraged teams within the agency to kind of experiment with this per the previous step. They did. It worked out well. And so the moral of this piece is empowerment is key, right? You got to give people freedom to do their jobs. You got to let them do it the way they want. You got to take away boundaries. You got to get rid of all of the limitations that might be placed on those people. Now, the end of the story is that it doesn't necessarily have a terribly happy ending. When that fax hit the city administrator's office, the mayor that had hired me had lost the election. A new guy was coming in. He was admittedly very old school. He had been around for a long time. It was sort of a referendum on the new style of politics in a way. And it was pretty clear. They ended up sort of letting me go along with a lot of the other agency directors, and I think it was one of the big reasons why they did, because this was scary, right? This was crazy and different, and people didn't get it, and that's sort of what it was. Now, the crazy thing about it is that we were delivering results. That 17-person team that I told you about before, not only were they able to fit a ton more features and functionality in each one of those quarterly releases, but they also ended up saving $700,000 on their $2.6 million yearly budget. So they did more with less, okay? My PeopleSoft team, who were responsible for maintaining the PeopleSoft application, they basically measured their work by all of the features and functionality that they could fit in to a given time period. They were able to draw that line 30% farther down the page because of these things that we had tried. Now, I was hopeful that these metrics and the success would keep some of this stuff going, and that the attitudes of the people in the organization and the agency. Unfortunately, politics and fear won out, and the Roe migration was officially canceled with an email that I was going to read, but I decided not to. And I'll leave it to your imagination what that did to morale. I got a lot of emails about that after that happened. So it was interesting. But I do think that if it had gone to its natural conclusion, something interesting would have happened. And this is where I step out of experience and into pure theory. I'm learning terms today that I hadn't heard before, like adaptive organizations. And it's interesting because it sounds to me like that's exactly, this is my theory. This is what would have come out of the correct implementation of these three steps, right? If we, first of all, created a universally applicable and sort of central theme and vision for people to focus on. Secondly, allowed for experimentation and allowed for failure. And then third, empowered people to do their jobs the way they wanted to and the way that worked best for them. We would naturally have an organization that would almost deorganize. In my head, I had this picture of a network with nodes on a network and individuals literally migrating from node to node based on their skills, what projects they could work on. In some nodes, you'd have technically a manager who reported to, or a subordinate who reported to a manager. In another node, you'd have a subordinate or a manager reporting to that subordinate. And if it was done right, this would provide us with a completely efficient allocation of resources and truly allow us to do more with less. I think there are a couple of parallels to this. You have, startup companies, small startups, where literally, people hand out titles like candy, but they don't mean anything because everybody does everything, and people end up sort of naturally gravitating towards the areas that they're most interested in and that they're most focused on. Political campaigns, interestingly, I think, do the same thing, especially for underdog candidates, because they're not necessarily very well funded, but they get a lot of people who want to work on them. And so you get this natural sort of migration of people and talents into different nodes where they can be most effective. So just to conclude, I know I've gone a little over and I apologize for that. I think the big unanswered question for me, and maybe this is something we can talk about, when organizations mature, we tend to create these hierarchical structures, and I don't necessarily understand why. I wonder if it's a trust issue. I wonder if maybe we just lack the appropriate mechanisms or concepts that allow us to handle growth in a rational way. Maybe we just don't have any really good examples of a big organization working that way and things that are not well communicated. And so these are all things that I kind of ponder, and I wonder if that's the case. I'm happy, and I'd love to discuss all of this stuff. And on that note, thank you guys very much. Sorry I went a little late.
Thanks, Bryan.